ahead and introduce myself. My name is Claire. I'm an event lead at Capital One. And so what that means is I spend my time hosting events similar to this one to help folks get to know and learn more about Capital One. We appreciate you for joining us here today at our Way Up event. We love working with Way Up. And we're excited to share more details with you about the behavioral interview. Before we get started, I do want to introduce a couple other folks on the call and let a few other people say hello today. So my colleague in these events is Denise. So Denise helps out with she's managing the screen share right now and helps out with a few other logistics of the event. So if you hear from Denise, she works together with me to help make sure these events go off without a hitch. We also have a few recruiters on the call. I don't know if you guys want to come off mute and say hi, Alex. I will kick to you to say hello.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Claire. My name is Alex. I am the business analyst internship recruiter for the East Coast, and my colleague, August.
Thanks, Alex. Hey, I'm also a business analyst recruiter here at Capital One, and I cover the analyst internship program and the full-time program as well.
Hey, everyone. I'm Sahara. I'm another recruiter here at Capital One, recruiting for ADP and AIP.
Awesome. So Alex, August, and Sahara are going to be answering questions in the Q&A. So throughout the event, feel free to drop any questions that you might have in that Q&A feature here in Zoom. So you'll see that on the bottom bar. The order of it varies, but it's usually pretty close to the chat box. If you click there, you can submit any questions in the Q&A. We'll be answering those throughout the event. So be sure to click over and see the questions that we've answered as well, because you may have asked a similar question, and we try not to repeat too many times so that we can get as much information out as we can. And so be sure to check over into the answered questions as well to see if we've already answered a similar question to yours. But drop your questions in the Q&A. We will also save time at the end of the event for a live Q&A. So some of your questions we will elect to answer live at the end of the event. And the four of us, myself, Alex, August, and Sahara, will be answering questions throughout the event. So you can start dropping your questions now if you'd like. I'm going to pass now. We're so excited to be presenting this topic. We understand that the job search process has a lot of steps, and each step of the way is very new to many of us. At some point, it's new to all of us, right? Not everyone. You've got to do a first interview or a first resume at some point. And so this is a topic that we know quite a bit about, interviewing, and are excited to be able to share our knowledge with the Way Up audience here today. I want to pass over to my colleague, Drew, who's going to help demystify a little bit about behavioral interviews. Thank you for being here, Drew.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Hey, y'all. So glad you're here, and I see we're already lighting up that Q&A, which we love to see that. So thanks so much for doing it. So to introduce myself, my name is Drew Savage. I work at Capital One. I'm located right now, actually, in the Richmond office. I'm coming to you live from Capital One in Richmond. These are my two boys, Wyatt and Elliot. They are 3 and 1. They are my world and also my greatest source of energy loss that I currently have. The reason I'm here today is because I'm BI calibrated, behavioral interviewing calibrated. What that means is I went through a training to be able to conduct behavioral interviews for candidates at Capital One, wanting to join Capital One. So I've gone through a training process. Before I was here at Capital One, I actually used to work at UVA as a career advisor, so we did lots of career coaching. I also saw someone posted in the chat that they are coming from Clemson, South Carolina. I will not hold that against you. I went to South Carolina for grad school for USC, so go Gamecocks, but love to see that. I used to be an academic advisor as well. And like I mentioned, I'm a proud husband and father of 2 wonderful boys. So I share that to share with you that when you're going through the interview process, your interviewers are people too. It may feel like they're not, but they are human beings who have been where you are before and have multiple layers to their identities as well. So I think it's important to recognize that in this session that I am more than just someone from Capital One talking about interviewing. I am a human who there are things you can connect with me on throughout that conversation as well. So let's get into some content here. Let's have some fun. I love interviewing. I think it's a valuable thing to review. I think it's also a skill that is sometimes under practiced. So I think today we're hoping to get out to you all is, what is a behavioral interview? Like, what does it actually mean? How do they work at Capital One? What is this STAR method, and why are people talking about stars? And we're going to actually walk through a little bit of practice there to look at some examples and kind of figure out which one's the strongest. And want to definitely lots of time for Q&A. Again, I see it lighting up. I love to see it. Want to make sure we get to your questions, because this session is really for you to help you leave here feeling more confident about interviewing. Let's jump into these on the next slide. So what is behavioral interviewing? So there are 3 different interviews that we conduct at Capital One. Depending on what roles you're applying for or interviewing for, you're going to have different variations of these. So one that we're here today talking about is behavioral interview. There are technical or job fit interviews, and there's also case interviews. It's important that as you're preparing, you practice for each of these. One is not necessarily more important than the other. And if one is not up to snuff, it won't matter how well you do in the other ones, because your other one wasn't as strong. So I think sometimes behavioral feels a little bit more natural because we are more exposed to it. But that familiarity can be a crutch too. We have to lean into that and practice it and really refine our skills. So let's keep diving deeper on the next slide, Denise. So behavioral interviews, what are they? So they're really looking at your past experiences to assess a little bit about how you might behave in similar situations in your role. So sometimes past behavior is a great indicator of future performance. So looking at how you may have handled something in the past and how you might handle it so that you've encountered that here at Capital One or other organizations. So rather than asking theoretical, how would you handle, they're asking, how did you handle? Again, the key here being, we want to see concrete examples of time that you have done specific things. I know sometimes it can feel like, hey, I don't really have a great example for that. So you might answer it hypothetically. That makes total sense. But the real key is here to show, hey, I've done this kind of work, and like, here was the result of that, and here was how I handled it. And that's going to give the interviewer a great line of sight to your judgment and decision-making skills. I will say that in behavioral interviews, you're not going to be asked questions like, how would you explain the internet to a caveman? That sounds really hard. And I would hope to not be asked that question, because that isn't based upon your past behavior. You may be asked something along the lines of, when's the last time you had to explain a new concept to someone who maybe didn't have the background? How would you handle that situation? That is a question you could be asked. So thinking of the ways in which they are framed, I think can really help sort of get a sense of what behavioral interviews might look like. So again, I think the thing to take away from this slide here is the first section, where it talks about how you've navigated those situations in the past and how it might lead to you interacting in those events in the future in these roles. So the next slide, what we will see is just a quote to reiterate what I just said to hope we really drive it home. So past performance is really going to be the best indicator of future performance. It's most helpful to hear realistic examples of your work rather than being asked how you might hypothetically do in faced with a situation. I make the metaphor here of writing sometimes. When you're writing an essay, we've all had those English teachers, right, who say there's supported versus unsupported statements. Supported statements here are the ones where you're going to give the really great examples. And you're right, you can't just make these wild accusations and not support them. You can't have to cite your resources. It's the same kind of thing here with experiences. If I were to say to you, if I'm just meeting you, that I'm a really great event planner, you might believe me. If I don't give you any examples of times I've done successful events and what results I've seen from those, you don't really have much to judge me on except for my word. And you might think I'm trustworthy. I promise I am. But by me supporting that, I'm giving you as a listener a lot more evidence of like, hey, he's saying he's a good event planner, and he's giving me all these great examples of time that he's done these really successful events and what those results might have looked like. So that's kind of the difference between supported versus unsupported in these examples and these questions. So next slide here for us. We'll take some time on this one. This is the STAR method. So likely you have heard in the past, hey, when you're asked behavioral interviews, we recommend utilizing the STAR method. And you may or may not know what that is. So STAR stands for situation, task, action, and result. What this really is for you is a way to frame and structure your responses. I think it's difficult sometimes to make sure we're covering all the different components that are needed in an interview response, and STAR gives you a framework to follow. So situation is basically context. You're setting the stage and giving context to the interviewer so they know enough to be able to make sense of what you're saying and what the situation actually was. But the background, you'll notice the word brief here as well. You do want to keep this part relatively brief because in this, you're only providing context. You're not actually giving them anything about what you actually did or the results. You want to make sure you don't spend too much time on this. You can get to the real meat of your response, but it is incredibly important to give context. The interviewer can follow what you are saying. The task is what was the task you were hoping to accomplish? This is sometimes also called obstacle. What was the obstacle? What was the hurdle? What did you have to overcome? What was the action that was really needed? Giving that description helps provide a framework for how you made those decisions. The action is like what you did, the actual action in the situation. What skills did you use? How did you handle it? And then the result is probably one of, if not the most important piece here. How did it unfold? What did you learn? What were the tangible results? If you don't tell me that, it's impossible for me to know if you were either successful or unsuccessful with the initiative. If you set out a goal to fundraise for a really important nonprofit to you and you had 1,000 attendees come to the event and it was a wildly successful event, like that's great. But if you don't tell me how much money you raised, it doesn't really tell me if your success with fundraising as a skill set. I don't know how successful you were. I want to know those results. So STAR gives you that framework to when you're thinking through your questions, how you can structure each response. Now, that being said, this comes with practice. A lot of times what we will recommend is that you're pressing with a partner, thinking through how you can cover each of these different portions of the question can really help you to make sure you stay organized and structured in your responses. And you'll find that as you are practicing this, it will start to come more naturally. You will know, okay, got to make sure I give some context, got to get the task, got to get the action, got to get the result. It's going to come naturally to you, but it does take practice. As with any skill and really anything in life, practice makes perfect. So make sure you're taking the time to rehearse these skills and make sure you're feeling confident going into your first interview. I also always say you say this to my students, say this to all the candidates I talk to, you don't want your practice round to be your interview. You want your practice round to be 3 or 4 weeks before the interview. So don't wait until you have an interview to start practicing. Start practicing now before things are really going. Make sure you feel like you're ready to go. So once an interview does come up, you're like, I got this. I'm ready. I'm going to refine my skills and I'm all set to go. Let's keep breaking STAR down and give some examples in a couple of slides so you can see what it actually looks like. Let's go to the next slide, Denise, for us here. So when we're applying that STAR method, there are a couple of things to really keep in mind to kind of keep you focused in that structure. So center your experience. So think about the role that you played. And what does that mean? Well, a lot of times we have in school or in our projects teams that we work with, and it's totally fine to answer your questions and talking about work you did as a team, but it's much more important that you highlight the skills that you gained and that you put out there. If I tell you I worked on a team and we created this great result for my client that we worked with, and the client was really happy and it was a great result. That's awesome that you did that on your team, but I don't know what you did. Maybe you were that team member that didn't actually participate and your team carried you through, which is great that you got the result, but I don't know enough of what you contributed. So focus more on you and what you gained. You can still utilize team examples. I just don't recommend focusing on the impact that you had on that group. Be thorough. Don't be afraid to use experiences in all parts of your life. So the tendency comes of, oh, I have to only talk about a past internship experience, or I only can talk about work experience. That's not true. Talk about your involvements that you had, past jobs that you had, lessons you learned. If they were key experiences for you that were monumental to your growth that can apply to the question, feel free to use those. You don't want to come across homogenous. You want to make sure you're utilizing different examples from different parts of your life to show your depth as a candidate. So it's really important to do that. Remember the question. I think that sounds really funny, but it's really important. Sometimes when we're in interviews, I think we can all admit that we're nervous because we want to do well. We want to get the role. Sometimes people start to talk a little bit faster than maybe they should. And sometimes you may just what we call word vomit, where you just sort of start talking and spewing off words. They don't actually make any sense. And you answered a question, but it wasn't the question that was asked of you, or you weren't clear. A couple things we can do in this situation. Number one, if you feel like that's happening to you, I think you can finish your response and say, that was a lot of words. Wanted to double check really quick. Was I able to answer your question? Okay, you can do that double checking. I think the other thing you can do is you don't have to start your response as soon as the interviewer stops asking their question. So if I ask you a question, you're really stumped by it, I would much prefer you to say, Drew, that's a great question. Like, I'm just going to take 1 minute to think about it. I'd rather you do that and take some 10 seconds to pause versus beginning your answer and not actually answer the question at all. It's going to make you look better and more prepared, and it's okay. The natural response, it's not a back and forth thing where as soon as I stop talking, you have to start talking, though it may feel that way. Not true at all. Take the time you need to form like a full and articulate response. And practice. I've already talked about it a couple of times. You'll hear it a few more. We're going to keep pushing that practice component. When you practice, I want you to practice with someone who's going to give you real, tangible, constructive feedback. Don't practice with your best friend who loves you and just say, "It's a great job." That's great for your confidence. I think that's wonderful, but I want you to get really good feedback so you can act on that feedback to make a good move toward advancing yourself in the future. So let's go to that next slide and keep diving into STAR a little bit more. So here are some just examples of what those STAR questions might look like. I think the tendency is, okay, well, I'm going to practice all these questions. I'm going to make sure I'm ready to go and I'll be ready for my interview. And my advice is not to prepare based upon questions, because these questions can be asked in any number of structures and organizations, and the likelihood of you only practicing the questions you're going to be asked is pretty slim to none. I don't want you to practice these 10 most commonly asked behavioral interview questions and then get one that wasn't on that list and then feel unprepared when you're trying to answer it and kind of feeling stuck. I think I can personally say I have had times where I was asked a question I had no idea or no preparation for. It happens to all of us. But here's some examples. So describe a situation where you already use persuasion, successfully convince someone to see things your way. Try a situation where you use good judgment, logic to solve a problem. So very different questions. They kind of start the same, but they kind of end differently. So get different situations kind of work there. Give me an example of a time where you had to conform to a policy in which you did not agree. An example of a time when you tried to accomplish something and failed. That one I know feels really hard. Both of those questions feel really difficult because in the moment, you might not be able to think of an example to both of those. And I think that can feel kind of paralyzing of like, well, what am I supposed to do? My advice is to stay adjacent to it. So when you see the word failed, that can mean lots of different things. That can mean maybe something didn't go as it planned. Maybe you didn't meet the goal you were hoping to get to, but you can frame that in any way that you want to. And when anytime you're talking about failure or weaknesses or things along those lines, it's most important you talk about the growth that happened after that failure or that weakness. So, hey, I've noticed that I sometimes really struggle with X concept, and here's like XYZ ways I'm working to improve that concept. And that is totally fine. No one is perfect. We've all made and will continue to make mistakes. We all have things that maybe we're not as strong with. And I try to reframe the word weakness as areas of opportunity. Everybody has things that don't come as naturally to them. An example for me, I really struggle with organization. I am a ideas person. I am a relationship person. I'm a facilitator, but I don't really love like lots of Excel sheets and organization and structure. It's just not something I'm really naturally very good at. My role really necessitates doing those things. So I have had to, by nature, get better at that to effectively work in my job. It's been really good for me, I think, to lean into that weakness, an opportunity to really make it more of a strength. And now I actually like it's a little bit more of a strength for me because I have worked on it so much. Another example, I used to be mortified of public speaking or getting in front of a group of people. I would stutter. I would talk so fast you couldn't understand me. It was awful. I didn't do well on those presentations in middle school and high school. Let me just tell you that. But I've gotten really comfortable with that. I was a communications major in undergrad and loved it and got graded on the way in which I delivered speeches. So I think there are always ways you can refine those things. It's all about how you tell that story. Tell me about a time when you had to go up and beyond the call of duty to get a job done, or when you were forced to make an unpopular decision. That's a hard one, right? So again, if you don't have an answer to that, just think about something adjacent. So here's how I could break down that last question, unpopular decision. That could be maybe in a group project, maybe when you had to kind of like push something forward in a group project. That could be in a student organization. You could think about a time when you had to kind of redirect an initiative there or enforce something. And I think the policy question can kind of come into play too. Like if you're an RA and you're enforcing a policy, things like that. So there's lots of different things you can kind of pull into these. So my advice is don't focus on the question, focus on the stories. What stories for you are really impactful or telling and have good results? Think about those. Those stories are often flexible and fluid that you can use them for different questions. So depending upon the way a question is asked, maybe you weren't expecting that question, but you have a really great story you could pull into that. So when I prep for interviews, sometimes I'll write down for myself like a couple different stories I want to make sure I hit on and cover in those. And that's kind of my guiding light. If like I get stuck, I can see, oh shoot, like that's a great point. I can talk about that one. I can use it as my example. So hope that's helpful. I think the story approach really is a strong one to really use there. Cool. So here's an example of one of those behavioral interview questions. Provide an example of a goal you've set and how you achieved it. So I leverage this role at Capital One as an example here and put this from my perspective. So when I first transitioned to my role at Capital One, I was a bit shy of meeting my first quarter event goal. This motivated me to meet my event target during the second quarter. I asked my sales manager to coach me on my techniques and event strategies. And with this new goal, I did well in the second quarter. I'm curious, like, and I'm going to watch the chat here. What is good about this response? Like, what do you all think like is strong here at this person? If this is an answer to the question, like, what do you think looks good? And I'll watch and see what people are thinking here. Shows growth. Yeah, great point, Hope. Love that. What you did, it is very concise. Situation is very clear. Absolutely. It follows the start. Absolutely. Perfect. Love that. Yes, these are so good. Very stepwise. Yes. So let me ask the other side, what could be better? This does cover STAR. We've checked our boxes, but what could be a little bit better? What do you think? Add more numbers, more details, quantifiable. Yes, you all are getting it. Love that. Precise number. Yes. What are the results? Exactly. So what was that first quarter goal? What was your second quarter goal? How did you meet that goal? What do those numbers look like? Like we need more to know how you did what you did and how successful it was. It's a great response. Like it gives you a good detail, but there's so much more you could give to this to make it stronger of a response and really frame it to be successful. So such great points here. Y'all did a great job. Let's go to the next one. We're gonna do it again. Let's see what you got on this next example. Oh, here's a fun one. Tell me about a mistake that you made. How did you handle it? Don't we all just love talking about our mistakes? That's a super fun thing to do. Let's talk about this situation. I was working as an events lead and I was responsible for ordering branding materials for an event with an important partner. Unfortunately, I mixed up the information from another event and the package was delivered to the wrong address on the other side of town. I took this very seriously and knew I needed to find a solution as quickly as possible because we're on a tight deadline. I need to identify a way to get those materials to the right location. So after considering a few options, I drove to the location, did the materials, delivered them to the right venue an hour before the event. And the result, the partner never knew about the mix-up and identified a new process for delivery to prevent the same mistake from happening again. What do you think about this one? What is strong about this response? Yeah, that's good feedback about the response. Now I'll talk about that in a second. Great. More detailed. Yep. Actions you took. Very, yep. Good problem solving. Love that. Anything else good about this one? Very clear, easy to understand. Beautiful. Awesome. Taking ownership. Yes. Taking ownership, like acknowledging that like a mistake was made, but also like preserving that relationship with your partner to make it really strong. Tell the story, not robotic. Absolutely. So it feels like a story. And I think like that storytelling is, I think, a great way to describe interviewing. Interviewing kind of sounds scary in some ways, but storytelling is less scary. And that's what you're doing. You're telling your own story. So I think it's really important to frame it in that way. Anything else that we want to think about maybe could be better in this response? Any opportunities for improvement? More numbers? Yep. Numbers, yep. Quantifying. Yep. Love that. And quantifying, as you talk about in resume reviews, can look a lot of different ways. It can be the amount of money that you raised. It can be about increasing efficiency. It can be about the number of people that you worked with. It can be about like a range of something. Like there's lots of different ways you can quantify things. So I think that's really important. I want to go back to someone in the chat said it felt like in the result, you sort of were avoiding the situation a little bit. So I think in here, the hope is to indicate like, hey, I identified there was an issue and I am working to create a new process to mitigate that issue happening again in the future. So it's showing proactiveness instead of just saying, hey, I got away with this. It all worked out in my favor. It's saying, hey, this happened, didn't love how that felt. So I decided to take a step and make a new process to avoid that issue happening again in the future. Proactiveness is so important. Showing forward thinkingness is incredibly essential and a higher level skill. If you're going to show someone that you can identify a problem and create a new process to prevent that problem happening again in the future, that is a beautiful thing. And I guarantee you will be impressive to your interviewers. So really, really important. So just some like general advice for behavioral interviews. So be confident in your way to answer the questions, but don't overcompensate. So what does that mean? So here I always say, if you don't come across to me confident about yourself and your role, how can I, as the interviewer, feel confident in your ability to do the role itself? So confidence comes through in a lot of different ways. It comes through in eye contact. It comes through in vocal inflection. It comes through in the way in which you hold yourself physically on an interview, either virtually or in person. There are several different ways. The only way that I have ever been able to feel confident in something is to practice it, to get there. So I really think I go back to practice on number 3 here. I'll say it again, even for number 1. If you want to be confident, you need to practice to make sure that you can have that confidence in your interview. Bring your whole self to the interview. And what does that mean? So someone said on the last question that it didn't feel like a cookie cutter response, that it felt like a real holistic response. That's what we're looking for in interviews. That's what's remembered. If you give me a cookie cutter response to something that really doesn't feel unique to you, it's not going to tell as deep of a story as other examples might. So bring the whole version of yourself to the interview, because you're thinking about this too. Even though people say this all the time, you are also interviewing them. That is something that is happening in this process. You want to get a sense of how they respond to your questions. How do they treat you as an interviewee? Because at that time, like, you have a lot of power here as the interviewee. You can say, you know what, this isn't a great fit for me. Like, this is not the culture I'm looking for. Or this sounds great. I don't know. I want to kind of keep learning more here. But you do have some power to learn that. And it's important that as you're interviewing, you find a place where you're going to feel valued, supported, and encouraged in the role in which you're going to go into. So bring your whole self. The interview allows you to assess holistically, is this place a good fit? I put forth the best version of myself. I showed myself in the interview. I asked all the questions I wanted to ask. I feel really good about that. And now I can kind of think through, if I get the offer, do I want to take it? Or is it not the right opportunity for me? It just kind of depends. So important to think about. And then I have it on here 3 times as number 3 to really hone it in. Practice, practice, practice. And you have to keep practicing, because just like your resume, your experiences change, they're dynamic over time. You're going to continue to have more and new experiences throughout your time. As that happens, you have new examples to pull in from as well. So I really want to encourage you to do that. So practicing is important. Well, how do you practice? Let's go to that next slide for a second here for some advice on just that. So where can you get practice? So a couple of different places I'd recommend. If you are a university student, many career centers will have practice interview support available to you to use. There are also sometimes online resources as well you can leverage for that. And if you don't have access to that, one thing that I used to tell my students during the pandemic was, open up a Zoom, record yourself answering questions, and send that recording to someone and say, hey, can you look at this and tell me what you think about this response? Be it a trusted peer, be it a mentor, whatever it might be. You can just do that, or you can watch it yourself. I promise you, you will learn something about yourself. I also can promise it might be a little bit painful. No one likes the sound of their own voice or the way they answer things, but it's really good practice to do it anyway. That way, you know exactly how you're coming across to your interviewer. Peers and mentors, I already talked about this a little bit, but I'm talking about a peer who's going to give you honest feedback. We all have those friends who are really honest. This is their time to shine, to give you really good feedback. So think about that, or a mentor that you trust. be that from a past job, internship, a student organization partner, whoever that is, someone that you trust and give you really good constructive feedback. Illinois employers, we do events all the time that have opportunities to either practice interviewing, but also to just encourage the conversation about interviewing practices. So I would encourage you to do that and attend events. That could be a great way for you to get practice as well. I think alumni are oftentimes so happy to help with these concepts because, as I mentioned, we've all been where you are before. We've all had that moment of like, I'm not qualified. They're not going to want me. I'm not going to be able to answer these questions. It's happened to all of us. So I say, get those questions out now. Ask people. They're happy to help. I love when people ask me like, hey, I go to JMU. That's where our undergrad was. I'd love to talk to you a little bit more about your position, how you got there, what it's been like. You're gonna be like, I'm happy to do that. People love to help support people. So ask. The worst they can say is no. At least you tried. So I think it's great to get that. So a lot of different ways here you can kind of get some practice in. So hopefully you'll take advantage of those 3 opportunities. So let's go to the next slide. I think that we might be at some live Q&A here. So now you get to finally hear from more voices than just me. So I'll pass back to you, Claire.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Drew. I always feel like it's helpful, even having been in this event before. I feel like each time I hear you or hear it facilitated, I learn something a little bit new. So there's a lot of really great questions in the Q&A that I had saved to answer live. I feel like a lot of questions sort of surrounding like we talked about, like just being new and like trying to understand how to gauge. Do you have any advice for folks who are wondering, and this might be somewhere where we could also use some input from Alex, August, or Sahara, our recruiters, but do you have some advice for folks who are trying to gauge, like, what is an appropriate amount of time to spend responding to an interview question, or like, how do you know when you've said enough or when you need to spend more time on it? Do you have any advice there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of that comes into like practice. So I get the question all the time of how long should I be answering the question? You want me to tell you, you have 2 minutes and 30 seconds to answer a question and that's it. And I can't tell you that. And I can't say that because it depends upon how you structure your response with that STAR method. It depends upon how the action result kind of come into play. Look at your interviewer. Oftentimes your interviewer gives you lots of cues of when you may be talking a little bit too much or not enough, but it goes back to practice. If your response is practiced and sort of refined, I'm not going to say rehearsed, I don't want it to come across as robotic, but if it's a refined response, as long as you're saying things that matter and that are a part of that, sort of, you're in the clear. It's when you're kind of going off adjacent to it that you kind of, and you ramble, that you get a little bit in trouble. So my advice is to practice it and find a good response. I think like for most interview questions, I would say you don't want to go too much over like 2 minutes or 3 minutes. Like that would feel a little bit too long. But that said, as long as your answers are structured and supported, I don't want to give you a limitation there either. But I think as long as you're practicing and feeling good, but curious if recruiters have any other thoughts on that response too.
I'll jump in really quick on this one. One thing that I wrote in the chat was I like to like write it out similar to like how you presented it, Drew, like actually write down those different sections. I think that really helps you like wordsmith it as well. Like, all right, what is necessary in this section and what's not? So like sometimes it kind of just helps me get in the headspace of like, all right, this was the situation. Is this explained correctly? So just kind of taking it step by step so that you're not saying too much, not saying too little, and really kind of getting that message across in a clear and concise way so that you're not just like talking too much, but still giving enough detail to the interviewer.
I love that. I love that. And I think like, I love the callback of like gauging your interviewer and like making sure it stays a conversation. I think like that when we're nervous, we can have a tendency to want to like keep going. But I think like the reminder to always keep it a conversation is helpful. At least for me, it is. The reminder is helpful. Okay, so we had another question, again, sort of for folks sort of in this space of like trying to prepare. do you have any advice on how to, and again, this is somewhere we may have recruiters could support as well, for how to quantify experiences that are difficult to quantify? So when there's not like a natural number or a natural way to measure something, do you have any advice for like, what could you say? Like, what are some things that could quantify it?
Yeah, I think my simple answer is not everything necessarily has to be quantified. I think is the first response there. The result that you have on something could have nothing to do directly with numbers. And I think that's totally okay, as long as the result was really strong. I think of an example here. We can talk about like brand awareness. Like you can't really assess like brand awareness on limit. You can say, we were able to reach like 25 students and increase our brand awareness on something. Like, I think that is a great result to have, even though like I said number 25, but like I didn't like quantify any results beyond that point. So don't get too caught up in that. Result doesn't always mean necessarily that you quantified something. Result means like how it went, how you did, and what you learned. What you learned from something can be just as valuable as quantifying something. So we mentioned that in the example earlier that we saw where I kind of said, hey, I identified this problem and I created a solution as a workaround for next time. Like that's just as valuable as me saying, hey, I was able to execute and improve efficiency by 25%. I will also say that I think in some level it depends upon the role that you're interviewing for. If your role is really quantitative focused, I think it's great to incorporate more quantitative responses to things. But I think in other roles, it may matter a little bit less. So it can depend a little bit upon the role that you're going for. If you're applying for a role that is really technical, you're going to want to make sure you have some kind of technical background. So I think it just depends on the role a little bit too. But my initial advice is don't get too stuck in like, I got to have a quantified result to say here. If your result has little to do with that, that's okay. As long as you're indicating to me success, impact, and what you learned, that's what really matters. Any additional thoughts from August, Alex, or Sahara there?
No, I think you covered that pretty well, Drew. Like I would say, I know there's been times where I've done like resume reviews and helped a few folks kind of think through. I think we don't always think about things in numbers. So it's kind of like difficult to like put that range on it, but like they're just like one of the examples that I could recall was just like someone's like, hey, like I send out this newsletter. All right, but like how big is that audience, right? So like how many people are you sending out this newsletter to? So kind of just thinking and shifting your perspective, because I think sometimes we don't always think in numbers, but there's a way to quantify it and kind of just kind of shift your perspective a little bit on how you can add that and kind of give more of that context to your interviewer of what that number could be like.
August, I saw you came off mute too. Did you want to add to that one?
I was going to say they covered a lot of the bases. I would just say, for the most part, just sort of recontextualizing how you look at your role, thinking of those team sizes, people served, opening duties, closing duties. I think a lot of people, especially when I was doing a lot of resume reviews as well, a lot of people don't consider how much, I guess, unilateral work they've done in roles where they may have done a position and they may not consider how much that, teamwork experience or leadership experience could be applicable to other roles. I think a lot of people are really, focused on the nitty gritty of each position, but sometimes, it's just working in teams or just completing tasks prior to a deadline. A lot of this work can be multifaceted.
I love that. I think so for sure. And actually, that actually transitions really well into the question that I had wanted to ask next. I feel like we get this question a lot in resume reviews as well. But we had a question around not having like real world experience. And so I think probably like actual career or role experience that relates to the role but having experience being involved in the community through volunteer experience or, even classwork or coursework. So can you speak to advice or recommendations that you have for folks who maybe are stuck a little bit, feeling a little bit of stuck in not having actual work experience?
Yeah, I would also challenge the narrative that it's more on what skills you bring to a role versus like where you previously worked. So I always say to candidates, like, we don't expect you to have like founded Google by the time you try and intern here. It may feel that way. That's not the expectation. So all experiences are equally valid. Pull in those examples that you had from those community involvements that you worked in, your class projects that you worked through. I mean, a class project is such a great little ecosystem of an example for a response to a question, because we know there's always key players. There's always the leader. There's always one who's kind of behind. There's always one who's more organized. There's all different roles that happen there. It's a great opportunity to talk about the time that you worked in a team. Maybe you're on a leadership team in a student organization. Maybe you're a member of a student organization that really helped push an initiative through. There's any number of examples that are out there. So just because you don't have a tangible internship or work experience to pull from, I wouldn't worry about it at all. I focus on what experiences do you bring to the table? How are they applicable to which you're applying to? And how do you tell that story? The team cares more about what skills you have versus like where you've been before. And if the basic qualifications say you must have 10 years of work experience, maybe that's not the right role to apply to. But looking at those qualifications can help frame, is this a good fit for me or not? That kind of goes back to like reviewing the roles that you're applying for. But I would say I'd reframe it to skill-based versus experience-based. It's a great question though.
Yeah, and I think, Drew, do you agree? But I feel like sometimes the work experience may not be the right experience to have to answer a question. Like perhaps the best answer to a question is a community project that you worked on, or is a class coursework that you've done.
Yeah, I think you want to highlight the skills that are most applicable, right? Like don't feel forced to say, oh, I have this great internship, I have to try to put it in there. It's on your resume, I know about it, which is great. You want to pull in what's most applicable and what makes the most sense to showcase that skill set that you're being asked about. It's a great point, Claire.
Yeah, I like that. Alex, I see you came off mute as well.
Yeah, just to piggyback off that. So one of the great things that we do at Capital One is the best way that we assess our candidates is by the assessments we provide ourselves. So really, if you want to shore up any insecurities you may have in previous job experience or related experience to the questions being asked, just make sure that you're excelling on the assessments themselves, on the quantitative portions and your product portions if you're doing an analyst program or whatever program you're applying for. Just make sure that you're excelling on those assessments. It's the best way that we can determine a candidate that's going to be a good fit.
I love that. Yeah, I love that. I think like it's a great call out of like people who might have a little bit of anxiety about what their experience is and if it relates. I think that's great. Okay, so we have two questions that were kind of similar. So I'm going to sort of phrase them as one, and maybe we can approach the two different topics differently. But we had a question. It seems like there's a little bit of maybe anxiety or a little bit of heartburn, maybe is a better word, around like how questions in interviews may be received, or like how like a response may be received. So we have one person who asked like, how do we frame our they spoke to it as how do we take power and speak for ourselves? So like kind of advocating for yourself or framing your answers in a way that doesn't come across as overly arrogant. And then we had someone ask a similar question about like, how do you ask questions about a company's values in a way that doesn't feel overconfident, or like, I almost read that as also meaning to like, how do you address some of these topics that are meaningful to you without like, you know, off-putting your interviewer. So I think like, how much concern do you advise folks to give on like the perception that they're giving and like overconfident or over arrogant? Like how much, how do you advise in that space?
Yeah, and I think it's always great to be self-aware in how you're coming across in an interview. And I think thinking about the first impression you're making to the interviewer and the company, I think that's a really important thing to be thinking about. I think when I think about overconfidence and sort of like the word arrogance, I think a lot of that has to do with the tone and the way in which you're responding to questions. I think that we have a lot of control over the way in which we come across, and that arrogance, I think, again, that comes back to my favorite concept of practice. If you're actually answering the way in which you practice, someone will hopefully tell you if you're coming across sounding like an arrogant person. That's not an ideal place to be in, and you'll know that to reframe it. I will say that, like, obviously practicing a lot may lead you to feel arrogant because you're going to feel overconfident, which I think is part of this question here a little bit too. I would say stay humble in those moments, because this is the real show. Right? You're really doing it now. So I think framing it in like, this is important. I'm gonna put forth my best effort. I want to come across really confident, but I want to make sure I'm being humble in that response as well. So it's a great question. I think just self-awareness is really key here. And I think really making sure that you know how you're coming across in other interactions can really help with that. I think when asking about company culture, and I think I'm drawing a little bit here too from thinking about how sometimes folks will ask questions that are like really applicable on the website, like it's just there. There's a way in which you can ask really deep questions about a corporation's values and what they stand for, to showcase that you have put a lot of thought into it. I think those questions really resonate with people versus someone saying like, hey, like which one of the values do you think is most important at Capital One, versus, hey, I saw this value at Capital One of do the right thing, and here's why that's important to me. You know a little bit more about why it's important to you. Wow, like what a cool question. I know that candidate has looked at the values, and that candidate has thought how that value applies to them, and they're asking me how it applies to me too. They're assessing like, does this company actually live the values, or are they just words on a website? And that is really important. That goes back to what I said before about you interviewing them too. If you ask that question and your interviewer is like, I have no idea what to say, that tells me they might not live the values that they say that they do. And that tells you something about the organization itself as well. So when you have the opportunity, and you should always ask questions, never don't ask questions. You need to ask them. If there's not time because you've had such a great conversation and the interview is over, you send them in a follow-up email, and that's okay. You say, hey, we're at time. I have a couple questions. Would it be okay if I send it to you via email? That is fine to do. I know sometimes that happens, and that's also a good thing, y'all. If you don't have time for questions because your conversation has gone so well, that's a really good thing. That's okay. But you never want to say, no, I don't have any questions. Thanks for your time. Because you come across unprepared, you come across arrogant, you come across overconfident. That's not the look that you want to go for. So make sure you're always doing that. But curious, the recruiting teams, any other thoughts on those questions?
One thing that I'll just add to that, something that I saw a few candidates do that I thought was pretty cool was like after the questions, just to kind of showcase that you were really like listening and engaged with the interviewer's answers, kind of just like recapping, like, so what one of the examples was like, so what I'm understanding is like Capital One is really known for their work-life balance, or, you know, the analyst program is XYZ. So kind of just like recapping and getting that little engagement point of like showcasing like, hey, I was really listening and I'm not just asking a question to just ask a question. Like, this is something that's also important to me. So kind of going off of what Drew was saying earlier, and Claire, just like keeping it very conversational, right? Like just showing that you're engaged. And this is something that is important to you, and you're not just like asking a question just to do it.
I love that. And I think it's also a great way, the questions that you ask are a great way to tell your interviewer what's important to you, and like where, you know, like in a way, tell your interviewer about yourself. Like, you know, what you're looking for and what's important to you. I think, you know, is a powerful thing to be able to do even in the question, even when you're asking questions. So that actually just brings us right almost to being out of time. So I want to just share a couple of follow-up items that we are going to share as kind of like a next steps for folks in this event. So I have already dropped a link in the chat for folks to find other upcoming events. So I know we had a couple of questions about further interview preparation, about how can you find out more about certain programs or certain roles at Capital One? How can we learn more about other things about Capital One? So that link there is going to take you to events that we host on our own, where you can register for other events and learn more about Capital One. We'd love to see you there. I'm also dropping a link here to where you can, to our blog, where you can learn more about our students and grads roles, as well as there are blogs about interview tips, there are blogs about our benefits, all kinds of blog topics that can help you learn more about Capital One and the roles that we share there. And working here in items similar to this interview. And then the last link that I'm going to drop is a link to our students and grads career site. So you can find you can find listings about the roles where you can find out more. I think you can compare and contrast. You can turn on job alert and find out more about the when roles will be open, and make sure that you're aware when they become open. So I know we had a lot of questions about those, so that just covered a lot of ground. I wanted to be sure to get a chance to thank everyone who was on the call. So Denise, thank you so much for helping sort of on the back end of the event and screen sharing for us. Drew, thank you so much for being such a mindful facilitator and with so many helpful tips and tricks. Demystifying the behavioral interview a little bit. Hara, Alex, and August, it looks like we answered over 70 questions today just in typing. And so thank you so much for diligently attacking these questions. And then of course, Way Up, thank you so much for having us. It's always such a pleasure to get to introduce Capital One to your audiences. And then everyone who came, we really appreciate you spending your afternoon getting to know a little bit more about us. We hope you'll grab some of those links before the event ends in just a moment so that you can continue to learn about Capital One. We'd love to see you again at another event or to engage in a different way. So thank you so much for being here and have a great evening, everybody. Bye, everyone.